For our presentation today, you can call me Natalie Duncan, and my name is often misspelled this way. I just had it happen to me yesterday. So if you're confused on why I'm talking about this, I think it'll make sense in just a little bit. So, just for a bit of an overview for today's workshop, there are 4 or 5 main learning objectives that we're planning to address. So, the first one is what makes a good emissions reduction target and what makes a target science-based. So, we'll look a little bit into that, and then we'll also look into how supply chain data can support target achievement. And then we'll also have a brief discussion on how net zero differs from carbon neutral, as well as what good offsetting looks like, because these are often topics that come up in relationship to companies thinking about setting emission reduction targets, and it can get really confusing. Also, if you stick around to the end, we have some bonus information in today's session about one of the biggest developments in science-based target setting today, which is the publication of a version 2 of the current Science-Based Target Initiative guidance on how to set emission reduction targets. So stick around till the end for that. So let's start off with what makes a good emission reduction target. So what are the hallmarks of a good target? So this conversation today is actually going to be mostly about donuts. And I'm going to pose a question to you in the audience. So what if I told you that I am committing today to eating 50% less donuts? Your first reaction might be, that's great. This commitment will improve your health. Everyone should commit to eating 50% less donuts. But what you'll learn today is that this target that I just mentioned is missing key pieces of information for you to really understand if this is a good commitment. So, a better way to describe the target that I'm committing to would look something like this. I'm committing to eating a certain percent less donuts over a certain time frame, maybe over the next year, from a baseline of a certain amount of donuts. So the first key element of this target is how many donuts are you eating today? I think if I told you that I was eating 20 donuts a day and that I was committing to eat 50% less, you might look at me a little strange, as opposed to I'm eating 5 donuts a month and I'm committing to reduce that by 50%. You might also want to know, well, what reduction in donuts does your doctor recommend? Maybe my doctor thinks I need to reduce my donut consumption by 90% because I eat so many of them. We don't really know how healthy a 50% reduction is without this type of information. And then lastly, we come back to the question of time frame. Am I reducing my donut intake within a month, or am I going to try to get there over the next 2 years, 3 years? This is important information in order to know how long my commitment is going to last and how quickly I'll reach my target. So this is definitely a silly kind of example, but I'm going to use the consumption of donuts as an example throughout this presentation to teach you about science-based targets. And what we learned here is there are 3 components of a good emission reduction target. The percent reduction should be informed by scientific consensus. The emission reduction target should state the target year, so the time frame in which I aim to achieve the target. And it should also have a stated baseline against which we can measure and track progress to make sure that I'm actually achieving what I set out to do. What this looks like in terms of emissions instead of donuts often looks like this kind of standard language. So company X commits to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions X% by 20X from a base year of 20X. This is a really common target outline, and now that you're aware of it, you'll start seeing it all over. This is how companies communicate their emission reduction ambitions. And I pulled an example here that's publicly available just to show you kind of what this looks like in real life. So this is part of a building product company's near-term, short-term commitment, which says the company commits to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions 30% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. So as part of the three components of a good emission reduction target, I brought up this concept of the percent reduction being informed by science, and I want to dig further into what makes a target science-based. So a science-based target aims to reduce emissions in line with what the latest climate science deems is necessary in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that goal is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. For those listeners who may kind of follow climate talk more closely, you may be asking, haven't we already surpassed 1.5 degrees of warming? And yes, actually, the consensus is that we're already in the territory of dangerous levels of warming, but that this remains the goal of the Paris Agreement with the hope and intention of bending the curve on temperature rise. And this is actually a fascinating area if you're interested in learning more about the science behind this. There actually is another presentation freely accessible on the US Supply Chain Sustainability School website, and it's called An Introduction to Climate and Carbon if you're interested in learning more. So, one way to think about what climate scientists deem is necessary to keep emissions under a certain level is to visualize these reductions on a path from today towards the future. So, if we're coming back to our donut analogy, we can measure the number of donuts that are eaten today by the global population. And in order to stay healthy, doctors say that the global population should reduce the amount of donuts eaten over a certain amount of time towards zero. So, a science based target that's formulated for the near term is usually 5 to 10 years out from the year that it's set. So, it gives us kind of a midway point to understand our progress towards a healthier level of consumption of donuts. In the longer term, which climate scientists consider to be around 2050, we will have reduced our donut consumption, but the idea is there will always be some level of donut consumption that will happen beyond 2050. So some donuts are still going to be eaten. But going forward, when we reach this level of residual donut consumption, we can offset the amount of donuts by eating an equivalent amount of broccoli. Okay, let's swap out donut consumption with greenhouse gas emissions production. So, very similarly, global emissions production should reduce over time to a residual level of emissions beyond 2050. And after that, the residual emissions are offset by capturing and storing an equal amount of emissions. So, this introduces the concept of carbon offsetting, which will be required in these longer term timescales when we reach those residual emissions levels. Climate scientists and doctors agree that it's basically impossible or very, very hard to get the global population to eat zero donuts or produce zero emissions. So, no matter what you think about broccoli or carbon offsets, we will need some sort of offsetting tool in the future. It's a tricky topic. We're going to come back to this in a little more detail nearer to the end of the presentation. But that introduces kind of the concepts behind what net zero looks like. One of the challenges of climate science is that the climate is a global system, so it spans the entire globe. So we need to find a way to translate our understanding of what's needed in terms of global emission reductions down to the reductions that are needed at the industry level and all the way down to what does an individual company actually have to do. This is really challenging, but thankfully we have the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, which is an organization whose whole mission it is to define these global emission reduction targets and translate what climate scientists are saying down to the level of individual companies. In practice, if we come back to the donut analogy, SBTI gives guidance to determine how many donuts each person or each industry eats today, and then what's a reasonable reduction pathway going forward to 2050. And as you can imagine, different people eat a different amount of donuts and also have a more or less feasible path to reducing that number to something that's healthy. So we can take, a person that might have a higher natural metabolism than another person, they may be able to healthily eat more donuts. There also may be a couple of different people who all have a similar natural rate of metabolism, who are all eating right now a different number of donuts, but doctors have mapped a path for each of these people to all converge to eat the same amount of donuts that's healthy based on the characteristics of this group. So, in the world of emissions, different industries might have a different required or feasible rate of reduction, and different companies within one industry might be starting at different emission levels, but ultimately they all need to converge to the same target level of emissions. Based on what climate science and SBTI have determined to be each industry's emission budget, SBTI then quantified a kind of general percent reduction plan that's applicable for most companies. So the science-based reduction for most companies is a 4.2% linear annual reduction in scope 1 and 2, or your own operations, and a 2.5% linear annual reduction in scope 3. Some higher emitting industries, or we can think some people that particularly like to eat donuts and eat a lot of them, they have individual guidance to transition towards lower emissions over time. So SBTI does have these industry specific guidance documents that supplement the more general percent reduction plans. In addition to this, SBTI also outlines specific requirements for companies as they think about setting and achieving their targets. I won't go through all the details here, but in general, SBTI requires you to formulate your target in a way that's consistent between other companies, with the whole purpose of being able to compare ambition and progress between different companies. So it really allows us to hold companies accountable for progress on their emission reduction targets. Although some things have changed in the version 2 of the SBTI guidance, which I mentioned at the top of the call, these same principles still hold. There is an important lesson within what we're talking about, which is that the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, does not equal science-based targets. And what I mean by this is that a target can be science-based without being validated by the SBTI. However, SBTI does help companies set and validate their targets to ensure that they are indeed science-based. But the reason I want to bring this up is because it reveals the value of third-party verification or validation. SBTI now means something in the market. You may have already been asked by a customer to have SBTI validated targets because there's a certain amount of value in having an independent third party sign off on your target, making sure that it matches the criteria and making sure that it aligns to the best available climate science. That said, SBTI is not the only organization that helps companies set emission reduction targets. There are a number of different ones in the market right now, just listed a couple here. The Climate Pledge, Exponential Roadmap. There's also guidance forthcoming from ISO on net zero, and that's currently in public consultation. Similarly, the British Standards Institute also has a standard on carbon neutrality, which is different from net zero. We'll talk about that in a future slide. But in general, SBTI has kind of risen to the top in terms of adoption and acceptance in the market. So now I want to discuss a little bit around how supply chain data can support target achievement. And first, to kind of set the stage here, I want to give an example of a typical manufacturer's emissions profile. So this example is a tier one contractor, and the chart on the left shows the company's direct or operational emissions. But when we zoom out and we include its supply chain emissions, all the things it bought and the services and materials it procured, the transportation of those materials, waste, all those categories, the operational emissions are often only 1 to 5% of the total emissions picture. So engagement and collaboration with the supply chain is critical in order for companies to achieve their emissions reductions. When beginning to address supply chain emissions, the first step that companies often take or have to take is to measure their baseline. So, if you remember, this slide outlined the three components of an emission reduction target, and a key component is having a stated baseline against which you can measure your progress. So, let's look into how supply chain emissions can be baselined and measured. In order to establish the baseline, we need to go back to basics. And for this, we're bringing back our donuts, okay, in a slightly different way this time. Now we're role playing as a donut manufacturer. So the first thing I need to do in order to create a baseline is take an inventory of my operations. What am I buying to run my business at all of the donut plants that I operate? Companies are doing this every year to conduct their baseline greenhouse gas inventories. So they're looking at all their activities within a year and looking to measure the impact of these activities. So in the world of donuts, you could think about the measurement of these different ingredients in terms of calories. So we know that the flour in a donut contributes 8 total calories, whereas yeast maybe is 1 and sugar is 7 calories and so on. So in total, when we add up the impact, the nutritional impact of all of these materials, the donut contains 26 calories. I think this is a mini donut. I'm from Minnesota originally, and the Minnesota State Fair is going on right now. So I'm constantly thinking about mini donuts. So this is a mini donut. We're mini donut manufacturers today. So we can then map out these ingredients that we just measured based on their contribution to the total calories within the donut. Let's say I'm a particular type of donut manufacturer, okay? I'm a donut maker that's trying to reduce the calories in my donut to as close to as zero as possible. This is maybe like an Oprah initiative or something like that. I don't know. So I know what's contributing the most to my donut's calorie profile. So I'm going to think about how I may be able to reduce the calories per donut. And this is the same exercise we would do to measure our baseline greenhouse gas emissions. Again, what materials do you buy and what's the impact, this time the environmental impact of each material? And companies who have emission reduction targets use that baseline information to make decisions about where to begin engaging their suppliers. So from my measurement, I know that sugar and flour contribute the most to the total calories. 58% of the calories are from these two ingredients. So we can consider these as our hotspots where we should begin focusing our attention. We're going to restate this donut production example in the language of greenhouse gas emissions. So what we would say is that from our inventory work, we know that the majority of emissions come from two raw materials, sugar and enriched wheat flour. In order to reduce the emissions, we need to engage the suppliers that supply us these raw materials. There are two goals with this engagement. The first is that we want to collect primary data on raw material emissions. So for this, we would need to ask the supplier for the actual emissions they've measured, which will allow us to replace the estimates that we've made. It might be standard today to report calories per ingredient, but it's not standard right now to report emissions per raw material. So we often need to make estimates, and we want to clean those up to be sure that we're targeting the right hotspots to begin with. And the second goal is that we'll want to be able to track raw material emissions over time to ensure that our suppliers are also working to reduce their emissions and that we're able to document and report this every year. This same process I just described applies no matter your industry. So even if you're, say, a data center company selling hosting services, you still rely on the use of materials, machinery, and energy, things that you buy and are supplied to you in order to produce your product, even if it's less of a physical product in some cases. Having a good handle on where my hotspots for emissions are, what is the primary emissions data for these raw materials, and how the emissions of these materials are changing over time allows companies to track their emission reduction efforts that are happening upstream or sometimes downstream of their operations. It also allows companies to, in theory, prioritize buying from suppliers who are tracking and trying to reduce their impact over time. And we're seeing this happen in the procurement landscape more and more. So, this kind of prioritized buying or preferred supplier selection based on who is tracking and reducing their impact. So, I've put on the screen just a couple of commonly used methods to collect supply chain sustainability data. One of the big ones that you may be familiar with is EcoVadis. This asks suppliers to provide information on a company's environmental, social, and governance efforts and their progress made. There's a similar annual questionnaire, which is CDP, that's currently open and companies are responding to right now, actually. This also asks about company performance on sustainability issues. We've also seen requests for suppliers to have pact aligned data to share with customers. This just refers to product level emissions information. These are all just different ways for suppliers to report their baseline so that customers are able to measure and track progress. There's definitely a lot more to say on this topic, but I think staying involved with the supply chain sustainability school website will help you kind of stay up to date on training resources regarding like sharing supply chain data. That's the mission of this group. I just want to step back briefly just to talk about this concept of net zero and specifically how it differs from carbon neutral. So, we've been talking up until now about what it takes for emission reduction targets to be science-based to achieve net zero ambition, but we haven't talked about the concept of carbon neutral. So, carbon neutral and net zero are very similar, but they have important differences. First, carbon neutral usually only focuses on one type of greenhouse gas, and it's in the name, carbon. Net zero, on the other hand, covers all types of greenhouse gases. Carbon neutral also generally focuses on operational neutrality, so usually only scope 1 and 2, whereas net zero almost always covers scopes 1, 2, and 3. Carbon neutral does not really have a defined ambition for carbon reduction over time, whereas net zero ambition is usually aligned with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is the leading scientific body on climate change and is what SBTI uses to formulate its percent reduction ambitions. Carbon neutral also allows for offsetting, and that's part of the reason why there's no defined ambition for reduction, because at any point along your reduction pathway, carbon neutral allows for an equal amount of offsetting. Net zero, on the other hand, does not allow for offsetting, except in the longer term when there are those residual emissions, that late stage broccoli consumption, if you will. And I want to zoom in specifically on this last point because it really is the key differentiator between carbon neutral and net zero. So if we come back to this graphic from earlier in the presentation around net zero targets, we brought up the concept again of residual donut consumption, and this reflects the understanding that it's probably not possible to get donut consumption or emissions production or really anything down to zero, 0.00. There will always be some sort of residual something. So in net zero, beyond a certain time frame, the offsetting of these residual emissions is allowed. Versus for carbon neutral, there's an equivalent amount of broccoli being eaten at any of the interim years up to 2050 and beyond. So this actually gives you the ability then to claim carbon neutrality in any year. You can say, my company produces carbon neutral products, or my company's operations were carbon neutral in 2025. Whereas for net zero, your claims may sound more like we've set a target to achieve net zero by a certain date, or we're on the path to net zero. So it sounds a little bit different, and the type of communication that's allowed also creates different reactions in the marketplace. Again, broccoli, carbon offsetting here. The conversation around carbon offsets can be tricky because it can feel like by me just eating some additional broccoli, how does that actually have an impact on the fact that I'm still eating some donuts? So if we take this in the language of carbon emissions, I may be trying to capture some carbon by planting trees or saving a forest from being cut down, but I'm still pumping emissions into the atmosphere. So how does that work? Climate scientists actually agree that there is a role for carbon removals to be used to reach net zero by 2050. Again, this comes back to the concept of zero is a really hard number. It's a very absolute number. We know that zero is not realistic. There will be some level of residual emissions. So there's an understanding that some amount of carbon removal, carbon offsetting is needed. The tricky thing here is that many of these technologies are novel. So if we wait too long to develop these technologies when our emissions are residual, the cost will remain really, really high. But if we start to allow companies to purchase carbon offsets and support the development of these new technologies, we may be allowing companies to compensate too early, and we're not entirely sure how effective these carbon technologies might be. So we could be creating a bad situation by disincentivizing actual emission reductions on the path to net zero. And I just want to show a little graphic here on how carbon offsets work. So the concept is that carbon offsets should be a supplement to your own emission reduction efforts. So you're reducing your own emissions down to some residual level, this red box here, and then you put money toward some sort of other scheme or offset project, and you're investing in that project to help someone else reduce their emissions or remove emissions directly from the atmosphere. So by investing in that project, you have created that ability to reduce the amount of emissions that the project would have emitted, and you can then claim the credit for the amount of reduced emissions. And this amount should be the same as your residual emissions amount. And so together, your residual emissions and the credits that you bought for the avoided or removed emissions are the same, and that's how we reach zero. I think if you take anything from the discussion, it's that there's a role for some sort of offset or removal scheme, and there has to be a balance struck between waiting too long or allowing the use of credits too soon. I think that learning a bit more about the fundamentals of carbon offsetting can also help us better understand what best practices are considered to be today, which can help us know kind of if we're moving in the right direction. So to understand this a little better, I think it's worth taking some time to look into what does good offsetting look like. First, we're going to clean up our terminology a little bit. So carbon offsets are generated when an activity removes or reduces carbon emissions from the atmosphere. These offsets are then reported and they're verified, usually by a verification body. And then this verification body issues an associated number of carbon credits. That said, not all carbon credits are created equal. Broccoli is not the same as broccoli, it's not the same as broccoli. One of the things that makes carbon credits different is their origin story, or the type of project that created the offset in the first place. And when we think about types of projects, we can categorize them into two broad categories of carbon offsetting projects: avoid and reduce, and removal projects. The avoid and reduce projects will mostly be familiar, so it includes things like the generation of certain types of renewable energy, nature-based solutions like avoiding deforestation. We can also think of things like efficient appliances and cooking stove replacements as ways to reduce carbon emissions. On the removal side of things, reforestation might feel familiar. So growing more trees captures more carbon from the atmosphere. But then we also have technological carbon capture and storage technologies. Right now, these avoid and reduce projects make up around 80% of the available credits, whereas carbon removal projects are less common, more like 20%. I want to dig a bit deeper into these removal projects specifically because it is newer and it's in the middle of a really huge level of growth and expansion. I first want to note that we refer to these as carbon removal projects, but these techniques typically involve both the removal and the durable storage of the emissions that are captured, which is really critical for that long-term decrease in atmospheric emissions, which is what we're aiming for ultimately to keep temperatures at a hospitable level for humans. These carbon removal technologies are really interesting, and there's a whole world of scientific study right now around the actual capture and removal of carbon. But I thought I'd just give three examples for us today. The first one is direct air capture, which does what it says on the tin. It sucks carbon dioxide right out of the air. After it catches the carbon, you can then bury it underground, or you could use it. So you could sell the captured carbon dioxide to soda companies or building material companies who can pump that carbon back into their products. The second one is enhanced rock weathering, which you may be less familiar with, but the concept here is that you sprinkle these special kind of crushed rocks on the ground or onto a farmer's field. And when rain falls on the rocks, it helps to capture the carbon dioxide from the air. The carbon then travels via this water flow into the ground and basically speeds up the natural rock weathering process, which is the natural carbon cycle of the earth. And then the third is microalgae farming. So there are companies literally right now, today, that are growing absolutely giant farms of microalgae with the sole intention of harvesting it and then burying it in the Sahara Desert. That is an actual company technology happening today. Real screenshot from a real farm. And the concept here is that microalgae doesn't really need much to grow, basically water, some nutrients, and sun, and it captures carbon in its growth process. And it actually captures a huge amount of carbon per weight of algae. So you're creating these little carbon capture machines, and then you bury them, again, with the aim of enhancing the Earth's natural carbon cycle, taking it out of the atmosphere and into the ground. If we think of all of the world's atmospheric greenhouse gases as being contained in a bathtub, we can think about the avoid and reduce projects as basically turning down the tap, so putting less emissions into the atmosphere to begin with. In contrast, the removal credits are equivalent to basically unplugging the drain and removing the carbon already in the tub. I think it's a helpful, simple way of thinking about these two different forms of offset projects. Looking a little bit into offset costs, there's really a wide range just based on the maturity, feasibility, and technological readiness of these different projects. On the lower cost side of the scale, we have things like renewable energy generation and cook stove projects. Reforestation programs can also be down there as well. These are just indicative prices. They're not meant to be anything solid, but just to give you a sense right now of kind of the span in pricing, which gives a sense of the market development in carbon offset projects. We tend to think of $100 per ton of carbon as kind of a benchmark. And this comes from the fact that the European Union actually has right now its own compliance-based emission trading scheme. So they're basically selling credits based on this trading system and how many credits and how much emissions are produced by industry in the European Union. So in 2023, I think that price hit $100 a ton for the first time. And I need to look again at the latest pricing, but I think recently it's been more like $70 per ton. So these credits aren't really generated from a specific type of project, but it indicates the value that's being placed today on the production of a ton of carbon. So it can kind of be thought of as a benchmark for the value, again, that we're placing on carbon these days. On the upper end of the scale, carbon offsets can cost over $1,000 per ton. These are usually the more novel technologies, and they tend to be highly expensive because these projects are at the startup scale, but that number is expected to come down, and in some cases, and for some technology types, it already is. Back to this concept, though, of how do we know what makes a good offset project? How do we know? Well, the default answer when you ask that is in order to be robust, the offsetting project needs to have these four characteristics. So, first, it needs to be real, It needs to be verifiable and traceable. Like I could go out to the forest and confirm that you're growing the trees or doing what you said you were going to do. It also needs to be additional. So, additionality is a key concept in carbon offsetting, which refers to the fact that without additional financing through the sale of credits, this project never would have happened. So, the project has to only be possible with this additional flow of money from companies who are ultimately going to offtake the offset credits. This is important because some of the offset projects that I mentioned, like the renewable energy projects, are now reaching a point beyond additionality. So, in some cases, renewable energy is so cost effective that the developer doesn't need the money from the sale of offset credits to make it work. What that means is that some of these renewable energy credits are moot, basically. They're no longer eligible to generate offset credits. The third criteria is the projects need to be measurable. So you actually need to be able to confirm what would the business as usual baseline carbon emissions be, and then against that baseline, you have a claim over the avoided amount of carbon. And then the last characteristic is that it needs to be permanent. And the question of permanence is really interesting in terms of what is the scale of permanent? Is it something you can confirm is permanent over a human lifespan or longer? And there are different ways of going about thinking about what permanence means for different project types. I will say it gets very existential very quick. For example, how if you bury carbon underground, how do you put a sign in that area indicating there's buried carbon, do not drill? And how do you ensure that sign is itself permanent over decades and decades of human lifespan? So don't get too existential there, just to know that there are permanence questions and criteria. So in general, this RAMP acronym kind of defines what a robust offsetting project looks like. And these RAMP criteria are confirmed to be true by verifying bodies. So these verifying bodies should be independent, transparent, they should have robust governance. They should also avoid double counting, which means that they've set up an accurate sort of like register of carbon offsetting projects and are keeping track of the offsets generated from these projects so that two different companies can't make the same claim on the same project. They play a very important role, and I've listed three of the more well-known offset verification bodies, Verra, Gold Standard, and the American Carbon Registry, but there are a few others as well. When I introduced this slide, I mentioned that this is the default that people go to when defining good offsetting. But even offset projects that have met this robustness criteria and have been verified have come under scrutiny. So these are just a couple of headlines that have come out over the last few years. Some analysis saying that certain carbon offset projects are not additional, which we talked about, or did not produce the benefits that they said they would. We've also seen large swaths of forest that have been destroyed by forest fires, and companies like Microsoft and BP had invested in the protection of these forests in order to demonstrate the avoidance of carbon that would have been emitted by logging, for example. So, carbon offset projects up in smoke. It's a very direct headline. This is the world that we're in right now, though, of offsetting. So, in order to address this scrutiny and the real problems that exist with offsetting, there has been in the last few years a recent revitalized movement to better define what good offsetting practices means. And it's really centered around the concept of high integrity projects. So this is a real thing happening right now. There were some federal guidelines that had emerged from the Biden administration. I think there's more active and continued engagement from Europe on a similar sort of concept. And there are recommendations from certain voluntary organizations like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. These have all arisen from the response to the scrutiny of the carbon market, and there's definitely more to come on this front. So, what does this all mean for good offsetting practices? Offsetting should be secondary to direct reduction. But at the same time, climate scientists have agreed that some amount of carbon removal is needed. So it should be secondary, but not exclusive of offsetting, and particularly removal credits. We also know that different project types have unique pros and cons. So if you avoid logging a forest and then it goes up in flames, that's a unique consideration and scenario compared to the risks of getting involved in a super expensive startup scale direct air capture project. Awareness of these emerging guidelines on the concept of high integrity credits should hopefully help guide companies to making purchasing decisions. But at the end of the day, this is a novel and developing field, and this concept of good is still being fully defined. All right, what's next? A brief summary of what we learned, and we're going to talk a little bit about what to expect going forward. So, one of the biggest takeaways here is that the three components of a good emission reduction target lead you to the clear actions that need to be taken in order to formulate a target that you can feel good about. The first one is to measure your baseline. This will allow you to know where you're starting from and measure your progress over time. The next is to use SBTI's guidance to understand what percent reduction is needed based on your industry and informed by climate science. And then lastly, set your target year and begin reducing emissions and track those reductions year over year, which more than likely will require engaging your supply chain because, as we saw, you can't do it alone. And there was actually one more lesson that we learned to complement the three components of a good emission reduction target, which is that offsetting can be used as a supplemental action, but not as a replacement for the reductions that you're committing to. All right. We made it through. I promised at the top of the call that if you stuck it out to the end, we'd give you a bit more information on current updates happening at SBTI. So one call out that I just want to make before I pass it back to Wendy is that at the time of recording this presentation, the final version 2 of their guidance has been published. And there are major updates. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of them here. So, kind of the first one to know is that there are changes to the use of certificates in target achievement. So, specifically, they've modified their rules around the use of renewable energy certificates in Scope 2. And there are new options to use other types of credits in Scope 3, though they're still not allowing carbon credits to be used to show emission reduction progress. Again, that should be complementary, not replacing. There are also new target setting options, especially in Scope 1, and the details won't be overly interesting, maybe, except to say that they now have an option where instead of committing to reduce your emissions by a certain percent, you instead write a transition plan to retire old assets and replace them with lower carbon alternatives like using low carbon steel or electrification of machinery. There's also a requirement that SBTI targets have more buy-in at the highest level of the company. So this includes a requirement to have board sign-off, which really elevates the importance of the commitments that companies are making. And there are many, many more updates mentioned than I mentioned here. And if your company has an existing target, or you've been curious about learning more about SBTI, Wendy mentioned the follow-up survey, and I highly recommend flagging this in that so that her team at the Supply Chain Sustainability School can continue to support with educational tools that are most helpful. So just to wrap up, we learned today what makes a good emission reduction target, what makes it science-based, how supply chain data can help support target achievement, how net zero differs from carbon neutral, and lastly, what good offsetting looks like today. So thank you so much. You can find my contact information here and you'll receive the deck afterwards. I'm always happy to have a further conversation on this topic. And I hope that you now agree that I can call myself Natalie Duncan. Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, Natalie. Always a great session. Yeah, I know I say this after every time we do this, but yeah, I have to go out and get donuts because
You have to.
I have to. Yeah, so just a reminder that if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A or the chat function. If you think of a question after the fact, Natalie's kindly provided her details here. And like I said, we can follow up on anything that you think of after the fact. Obviously, this is sort of a changing environment with the new version of SBTI coming out quite recently. Really fascinating changes, particularly when it comes to collecting data from your supply chain. So if you are a member of a GC supply chain looking to get into or changing the way that you are measuring your carbon, reporting your carbon back to your clients and customers, it's a really fascinating space. I will just sort of, I'll put one question out just because I know we've got a little bit of time left, and I'm kind of hoping that it spurs a little bit of discussion, but no worries if not. Um, I'm always thinking about different sizes of organizations because we at the Supply Chain School work with everybody from the largest organizations to the one person organizations. Natalie, what would you say is the biggest obstacle to getting started with a science-based target?
Hmm. It's a good question because your observation that companies of all different sizes, that this may hit or be relevant to companies of all different sizes is spot on because companies that have these ambitious reduction targets have started to ask up their own supply chain for their suppliers to set their own targets and do their own SBTI analysis. And that's not unique to large companies. So your smaller companies can easily get caught into that expectation as well. And so, thinking about kind of like the biggest barrier to start, I would say companies that have not yet measured their baseline, so measured their greenhouse gas inventory, don't have a great place to start because you need to know what the profile of your emissions inventory looks like to know how to reduce. And we've seen multiple cases of times where we've worked with small companies, but with large companies as well, where performing the baseline exercise actually revealed that what we thought was the most impactful is not really the most impactful. We worked with a large global beverage company who has stores all over the world, and their most impactful category they believed was the cups that they served the beverage out of. But it
Mm.
was not. When we performed a complete inventory of their operations, it was the concrete that they used to build the hundreds and hundreds of stores. So that's just a perfect example of how performing the baseline and going through the process of setting a target can reveal completely different information and completely change your sustainability strategy.
Exactly. You don't know what you don't know. That's perfect. We do have a question from the audience here, and I love it. Can a company revise its previously approved SBTI targets near term if its emissions have increased due to ongoing business growth and company acquisitions compared to the original baseline? That's a really interesting question.
Really good question. There's so much in there, but the one thread I'll pull on is company has grown through acquisition. So that's a specific case where the SBTI has said if you grow through acquisition and therefore your business has changed significantly, you must rebaseline and resubmit that to SBTI. Now, what follows along from that, as in, do I have to restate my target or reformulate my target? Depends on how your profile has changed over time. I would love to chat about that case, and if you're interested and willing, my email contact is here. But there's a lot happening right now with the version 2 revisions that could also influence your decision around how and when to resubmit.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Natalie. And thank you for your question. I think I am going to wrap up the call. So if anybody does have any questions after the fact, like I said, please feel free to reach out to us. Um, just wanted to thank everyone for being on the call today. Thank you for your time and your attention. I know we're all busy, especially considering that it's, dog days of summer. So thank you for showing up. My sincere gratitude, huge thanks to Natalie. Another great presentation. Thank you so much for putting this on for us. I want to remind everyone of the feedback survey. If you could take a few minutes just to fill that out, that would be a huge help. And just another reminder that we are putting on webinars like this on many, many topics throughout the year. So please do keep an eye out on our event calendar on supplychainschool.com. And if you do require any support in any other topic that's related to sustainability, would encourage you to reach out to myself or my team, or just check out the website. We have lots of resources that are not webinars. We have e-modules and videos and all sorts of things that you can access. Just a quick note as we wrap up, if you were in attendance today, you will get a certificate of completion. That is ISET accredited, so please do keep an eye out on your dashboard for that. It should be popping up within the next couple of hours. If you don't receive your certificate, please reach out to me and I'll make sure that you get it. And I think that is everything. I'm just going through my little mental checklist. I think I've said everything. So thank you again for everyone. Thank you again to everyone for showing up. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your summer. And we'll see you at the next session. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.